You must be at least 18 years of age to listen to the following podcast. I am Robert Black, and you are listening to Sexual Heroes. John Pendal became the 25th International Mr. Leather in 2003, the only Briton ever to have won the title, and the following year became a regular host of the Mr. Chicago Leather Contest. In 2010, he began a decade-long career as a comedian traveling to clubs in cities across the United States and Europe. The pandemic brought his roles as leather contest host and comedian to a screeching halt. A self-described outsider with autism, John recognized the opportunity to pursue a new career as a life coach. He earned a diploma from the Animas Centre for Coaching and completed a course in first aid mental health. Since the interview for this podcast episode, John has been asked to return to host the 2022 Mr. Chicago Leather Contest. Hi, John. Welcome to Sexual Heroes. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Unlike some other guests who came to me through Twitter, I see people in this, a stream of things in my feed, and then they'll catch my eye. You were referred to me by a fan of yours.
I still have fans?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And I'm glad he did, because you're an interesting guy.
Okay. I feel like, you think of a radioactive half-life, and you use a Geiger counter and it beeps, beep, 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 beep. I just feel like my radioactivity has gone to zero. So I'm really surprised whenever anybody does this now.
I think once radioactive, always radioactive.
Thank you.
All right. So values. I was, researching you. Values seems to be, it's come up a number of times in your life. It seems to be something very important to you. In 2003, you won IML, and in your speech, you said, whatever your values, live up to the clothes you're wearing. And now today, I look at your website, and again, you talk about values. You ask, or you invite people to identify their own values because it's important. And you have an exercise on your website that people can do. Can you explain that exercise to people?
Sure. The values exercise is really useful when you're coaching people, and they might feel that they don't know the path forward or they don't know who they are. So we can give them a PDF or a sheet of paper, and it's got all these values on. And I added some because on the training I did, they didn't have inclusivity. And that was my number one. So I wrote it in. They were all very surprised when I read it because it wasn't there. But it's got all kinds of things. Some people are motivated by money or generosity or spirituality. Could be anything. But the exercise is you look at the list, and first of all, you just say out loud to your coach the things that are jumping out at you that resonate or that you aspire to or you admire in other people. And then together we whittle them down to a top 10, maybe a top 5, a top 3, and then we place the top 3 in order. So we're just focusing your attention. And this can be used in so many ways that are really useful. So if somebody's got a choice of, say, 2 different jobs to go for, and they don't know which career trajectory to take, we can see which job aligns with their values, because that's going to make them happier. But if you are in a process of working out, maybe you're non-binary or a member of the trans community, and all of a sudden the ground has shifted and you're not even sure what your personality is anymore, we can look at your values. They haven't changed. This is still who you are. We might be changing names and pronouns, but your values are who you are. Or it might be that somebody is in distress over arguments with friends, and we can just see if a value is being poked, that maybe the reason this argument is getting larger traction than you thought is because that value isn't important to you, but it's really important to them. Mm-hmm. It can also be used for people with ADHD or neurodivergent who are people pleasers and their to-do list is getting overwhelmed. And we can say, which jobs on your to-do list do you have to do because they have a deadline? And which ones do you want to do because they align with your values? And if they're neither urgent nor important, why are they on your to-do list? So there's loads of different ways we can use values.
So bottom line is, if you've got a handle on your values, your life can simpler, happier. Yeah.
And sometimes people have dissonance in their life. Say your top value is environmentalism and you work for an environmental charity. And in theory, you should be really happy. But maybe within the office, they're not recycling. And so it's the value isn't just the big picture. It's your daily life. It's who your friends are, your relationships, your job, the way you live. The more you can align that to your values, the less dissonance you're going to have and the happier you'll be.
Okay. Well, I did the exercise.
Okay.
And so I'm going to share with you my top 3 in order. And I came out with number 1 was integrity. Mm-hmm. Number 2 was accomplishment. And number 3 was humor.
Okay.
And when I looked at the list that you had, when I saw humor on the list at first, my reaction was, that's not a value. That's an odd thing to have on this. But then I couldn't steer away from it. I kept coming back to it because I just found that really humor, sometimes that's all that gets us through. You know, when things are really, really, really bad, which they have been in the past couple of years for a lot of people, sometimes humor is all that gets you through.
It's interesting. I have 2 different client bases that I work with, and one is just general life coaching, maybe for neurodivergent people, and their values can be very different from each other. But as soon as I get to a kinky crowd, or maybe they've come to me via FetLife, I can pretty much guarantee I know 7 of your 10 values.
Uh-huh. And is humor usually on there?
Not always, but integrity usually is. Integrity is very important to kinky people.
Why do you think that is?
I think because there's so much self-awareness about what we do. And when we negotiate, we expect people to give genuine replies because if we get this wrong, we could be taking you into an area that's not good for you. So we really need that negotiation to be what we say it is.
Right. So my list didn't surprise you totally?
Not totally, no.
Okay.
But I'm glad humor was on there because I was a stand-up comedian before COVID hit. So that's how I made my money.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is all tying together. So my question is for you, what are your 3?
Inclusivity, honesty, and love. I remember inclusivity was my top one because everything about the training that I did during lockdown to become a coach really wound me up that it wasn't properly inclusive. Full of ableist thinking. I'm autistic. There was somebody else autistic in my group. We both had the experience that whenever there was an exercise, we each said in our group of students, we had to say a word about an exercise. We each had the experience, me and the other autistic person, of our word not being written up on the Zoom whiteboard because it didn't fit into the group think.
You write on your website, you wrote, in my 20s, when I realized I was gay, I carried a lot of internalized homophobia. I knew I didn't want to be effeminate or a girl, so I dressed in leather and tried to act butch. I often wonder now if part of my drive to win International Mr. Leather was an attempt to prove the bullies wrong.
That's very true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My whole school days, before I was even called gay, I was called a girl. So right from 3, kind of when we went to preschool, they knew I wasn't a traditional boy. I didn't want to go outside in the break time and play sport. I didn't want to do any kind of ball game. I was rather happier playing in the doll's house where the girls were. So even before sexuality ever came into it, they referred to me as the other gender, that I was a girl. And then that got my hackles up. I wasn't a girl. I was a boy who liked playing with dolls.
Mm-hmm.
So when I realized I was gay at the age of 22, it's like, okay, I'm happy to be gay, but I don't want to be one of those gays because they're the gays that are like girls and I'm not a girl. So I'll go the other way completely and I'll be as masculine as I can be. I'll be a masculine gay. I'll be a lumberjack, leather wearing. In my head, that's where I was going was I'm not a girl. I can be gay, but I'll be a masculine gay.
People work hard to earn a title. You don't just show up for a contest and poof, you win. There's a lot of thought and a lot of preparation that goes into being in a contest, even for a simple bar contest.
Oh, yes. I've emceed contests ever since. I see how much work goes in. Mm-hmm. I had 3 months to prepare between winning Mr. Hoist and going to IML. I had 3 months to prepare. And my every waking moment, I was doing something to prepare. I bored the pants off everybody I worked with because it was the sole topic of conversation for 3 months. I learned how to lay out a pattern on a hide. I presented giant checks to charities so I would get in the press. I read the judges' biographies, and if any of them had set up an organization or were involved in a charity, I got the training pack as if I was a volunteer, and I learned about how to join that organization. I learned about drug-resistant strains of gonorrhea. I learned all the previous IML winners and what they'd done with it. I crammed for 3 months because I knew that you weren't just judged in the timed sections. You were judged every second from when you landed to when they announced the winner. I wanted to sound as knowledgeable as possible.
That's a lot of work. I have a podcast. It's called Sexual Heroes. I think sexual heroes are really important, or I wouldn't have this podcast. And I think within the leather community, I think our title holders are our sexual heroes. I think there's somebody we look at. Yeah, they're like our superheroes.
I would rather value people, going back to values, for what they do rather than the title they have. For me, the heroes of the leather community are the folk that stay behind looking after pets so that somebody can go and work at a bar, or the security staff that man the doors and women the doors so that we're not queer bashed on the way out. All the people who may not have the looks to win and be on stage, or the gift of the gab to have a microphone, but are doing the work. And it would really upset me during my year when they'd say, we've raised more money tonight than ever before. This is all on you for getting on the microphone. And I would look at a team of guys with dirty knees who had been on the floor all night measuring crotch to ankle with strips of raffle tickets, working that crowd for the night. And yet somehow I was getting the thanks because 3 times during being given free drinks, I got on a mic and told people what we were there for. It was never about me. It was always about the volunteers.
I've known a lot of title holders, and they've all made great effort in their community and trying to live up to that title. And yes, you do not have to be a title holder to be valuable and contribute to the community. But I think having that person on that stage that says, hey, it's okay to be kinky, I'm validating that, you're all good, and I'm sort of a representation of that. I don't think that's a bad thing. You wrote that you had some internalized homophobia, you were bullied, and you also went through some gay conversion therapy?
Yeah, for 7 years.
7 years?
I know.
From when to when? From what age to what age?
15 to 22. Would you like the story?
Yeah.
So the first 15 years of my life, I had no friends at all, and I didn't know why. I knew I was getting bullied for being a girl, and maybe that was it, but I didn't know any more than that. And then at the age of 15, I joined an evangelical, happy-clappy church that had a very large youth group. And these people were commanded by God to be my friend. And that was intoxicating because I had never had friends before. But the only wrinkle was this church, the leadership worked out I was gay before I did. So they made me go and have weekly meetings with the church elders to basically pressurize me into not coming out as gay. And I was so clueless, I just saw this as extra attention. Like the hand of God was upon me because I was getting to meet the church elders. Nobody else was special like me. So I was quite happy about it, that the 7 years that I had it, because I was getting to hang out with the church elders. And that made me good, better than everybody else. And then at 22, I met a gay guy who wasn't at all like my church had painted. He didn't have horns. His head didn't spin 360. He wore normal clothes. He took me to a gay bar for the night. I sat on my hands. I don't know why I sat on my hands, but that's what I did. And then he took me home and I got out the car and I was so pious. I said, thank you for all your help, but I won't be going out with you because I'm not gay. Like, why? He didn't think he was going to go out with me. And the next day I hadn't been able to sleep overnight because my face hurt from grinning. I was like the Cheshire Cat. I had lockjaw from smiling, and I figured, there must be a reason for this. Putting 2 and 2 together, I must be gay, and my church has told me that honesty is good, so I'll phone and tell them. And they kicked me out on the spot. They said, gay isn't something you are, it's something you do. If you say you are gay, you must be doing something about it, and that's a sin. And then they threw me out. And because it was the kind of church where you weren't allowed to have non-Christian friends, I also lost every friend I had and had to start my life again. Fast forward to 45 years old, I'm in therapy. I happen to mention that I'm completely full of guilt and shame, 100%. That's the only two things inside of me. And the therapist is saying that's not actually normal. Why do you think that is? Something big must have happened to you. And we were going through all the things in my life that it might have been. And then finally, I just went, oh, well, I did have what I would call it now is gay conversion therapy for 7 years. And the therapist went, that might be it. This is why you're now walking around 100% full of shame, because somebody told you that you were wrong at your core. Not just that you'd done a wrong thing, but there was something actually wrong with you.
And that was at what age?
45.
So you've kept it with you a long time.
But in the same way that growing up to the age of 22, I thought I'm straight, but every straight man must feel the way I do. Every straight man must be attracted to other men. This is what being straight is. At the same time, I went through 45 years of my life completely full of guilt and shame, but thinking, this is how everybody is. Everybody feels this way. And it's only in therapy that I've realized that's not actually how you have to be, and you can let some of the shame go.
And that's long after you won IML.
Oh, yes. I did spend my whole IML year telling people that I felt broken. And I look back now and think, wow, just that was your conversation socially, not on stage. I had a rule on stage. I would only ever do things that benefited the local community. But privately, everybody I met, I just remember telling them that I felt broken.
Do you identify as a Leatherman today?
I am working that through because I have realized that I am autistic, and a leather kink space is an autistic friendly environment. So now I'm trying to work out how much of my attraction to that was because it's an autistically friendly environment and how much of that was actually my baseline sexuality. And I haven't yet got an answer on that.
Okay, we need to explore this. What makes a kink space an autistic friendly one?
Every autistic person is different. I can only speak for myself, and there will be some autistic people listening to this screaming that I'm saying the opposite of how they are. But this is how it is for me. First of all, I can't do small talk. I like conversations to have a point. And I find in vanilla pubs where people are flirting and chatting each other up, I can't join in because I don't know how to do it. But in a kink space, we tend to be much more direct. Oh, you're into nipple play. How about this, boy? Oh, you're into puppy play. Here's a chew toy. It's just direct, which is perfect for me. Secondly, I miss a lot of visual cues in everyday life that people say afterwards, oh, that's what that conversation was about, and I didn't know. But in a kink space, I have visual clues that help me. So if somebody walks in with rope tied to their waist, they're probably a rigger. If they have a black and white check hanky, they're probably into safe sex. If they're wearing a mule cap, they're probably a sir or a dominant. Like, people help me fill in the gaps when I'm in a kink space. In a vanilla bar, there's often a mirror ball, a drag queen shouting at the bar, cabaret. I can't cope with all the distractions. But in a kink environment, even if there's music, it tends to be a much lower volume so that people can concentrate on the play. And if it's a rope dojo, it's practically silent. I mean, that is about the most kink autistic friendly environment you can have. The spotlights are static and white, especially for needle play, because you have to see what you're doing. So it's not like a disco. What else? There are workshops in kink. There's no workshops for vanilla sex that I found. Nobody ever helped me with vanilla sex, fill in the gaps I didn't know. But in a kink space, pretty much from the first day I arrived, it's like, oh, well, Thursday night is discovery night. We'll have demos. Like, people help. Not only that, there's somebody in a high-vis jacket going around giving extra help while you play. There are dungeon monitors going, oh, you need bleach. Can we just wipe down the surfaces? In all the vanilla sex I ever had, nobody in a high-vis jacket ever came and helped me put on a condom. Kink and autism there's such an overlap just because the environment is friendlier to us. And if you're really, really lucky, there's a questionnaire. because spoken language is quite neurotypical, and often you will find autistic people prefer writing because they can think about their communication. So when a top says, respectfully submit a journal, or here's a questionnaire about your limits, that is just the most autistic friendly thing you can do.
Wow. So what you're trying to work out then, you said you were trying to work out in terms of your kink side, what are you trying to work out? How much of it is part of your sexuality and how much of it is just part of being autistic?
So for instance, if you are autistic, you need to spend some time regulating your senses because you will often be in a state of sensory dysregulation. And so autistic people might do things like sleep underneath a weighted blanket because it helps them to regulate. Well, I look back at some of the kinks I was doing, being in a sleep sack, being in inescapable bondage, having people walk on me, having big bears crush me. Was I just looking for a weighted blanket? I mean, I actually look at some of the kink scenes I did, and afterwards the words would come out of my mouth. Thank you. I feel reset. Isn't that a sign I was in a state of sensory dysregulation and I was using kink without realizing I was autistic to regulate myself?
I don't know if you've listened to any of my podcasts.
Yeah, I have.
Okay. Did you happen to listen to the one on BDSM research with Richard Sprott, the PhD?
No, that's one that I didn't.
Okay. Well, in that interview, I love that interview. I asked the question, is BDSM therapeutic? And I went on to explain that for me, I always felt it was. In fact, that was the draw when I got into it. I noticed that when I would go through an impact scene, like getting flogged, and I would rage and cry and all this stuff, afterwards, I felt, it felt cathartic. I would work through stuff during that scene, things that would go through my head. And, that's part of the research that they're doing is to determine, is that therapeutic?
Oh, yes. I had therapy for many years to try and get over phobias. And I had way more progress in a dungeon collared to a sir than I ever did with somebody with knitting needles and a relaxation tape. So, yes, I absolutely believe that BDSM can be therapeutic. What I would like to aim for is that it's therapeutic as a side effect, not as your main goal. And actually, if you're going into it as your main goal, maybe can we ask the question, should you be getting therapy? But is it therapeutic as a side effect? Undoubtedly, and love it for that.
I love that clarification. Side effect versus...
I can give another example. Every large scale leather event that I've been to in America, there is usually somebody outside with the smokers begging all of the heavy players to beat them in the dungeon as hard as they can, saying, I have never been able to feel anything in the dungeon, and I'm looking for the person that can break through. So they're doing BDSM for that therapy. And I would ask questions about how long has this been going on? Can you remember the first time you were ever disassociating from your feelings? Was it that you heard your parents argue as a kid and you went and hid? Were you abused as a child? Is there a bereavement that you've not dealt with? Because my worry is if somebody takes you up on this and hits you in the dungeon until we break through your barriers, we don't know what's coming out. And it could be rage, it could be grief, but all of a sudden that is a very non-consensual scene for everybody else around. And unless there are mental health professionals there to put you back together, we've just broken you. So if your goal is that you've never felt anything, maybe that's the time, can we discuss it in therapy to find out why? And after that, sure, we can beat you cathartically, but let's just find out what's going to pop out when we do.
Well, things definitely pop out for people, that's for sure, when they're playing. Yeah, I mean, the main reason I want to have somebody beat my back with a flogger is the endorphin high. I mean, that's number one.
I actually created a 3D model of BDSM to explain kink to call center workers who weren't kinky, but were taking in like on a sexual abuse helpline and needed to know about kink as part of their job without actually being kinky. So I created a 3D model of BDSM to explain it to them. And if you want to plot coordinates in a three-dimensional space, you've got an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis. How far across something is, how far up and down, and how far out and in. And I used to say that the x-axis was how much you like physical sensation. So somebody who scores very highly could be spanked for an hour and they'll have an orgasm. And somebody who scores 0 would be very happy facing the corner of the wall for an hour and not being touched. Mm-hmm. So we can be two different, two ends of that. The y-axis, how far up and down you are, is whether you want to be in an altered headspace or playing as yourself. So if you score highly in the Y, you might be a puppy, a master, a mistress, a horse, a slave, somebody other than you, some kind of role play, or dominant submissive. But if you were 0 on the y-axis, I would be John and you would be Robert. And we would play as ourselves. And then the z-axis, how far out and in, is how much you like being passive or aggressive. And for a long time, I thought if you were submissive, you were passive, because I would see people walking behind and presenting coffee on one knee and getting up early and polishing boots. And I was never like that. I wanted to be roped like a wild horse and have abductions and interrogations and wrestling and fight back. And I was always told I was a badly behaved boy when I did. I've realized now I just needed to find players who were happy scoring high on the z-axis, that they did that aggressive style of play. And then I can explain this to vanilla people by saying, if you're on the score highly on the x-axis, that physical sensation, you're looking for the endorphin rush. The same as a marathon runner getting a runner's high, or somebody addicted to aerobics classes who get an aerobics high, Buddhist monks who flog themselves to ecstasy. It's all the same endorphins, but for some reason yours are okay and ours are kinky, but it's the same chemical. And then if you score highly on the y-axis, you're altering your brain waves the same way you might if you did Buddhist meditation or you laid in a flotation tank in the lunch hour. That's seen as fine. But if we go in a sleep sack and alter our brain waves, somehow that's perverted. But it's the same altering your brain waves. And then the z-axis, how far out and in you are, is how much you like playing with adrenaline. And in regular society, we call people adrenaline junkies because they ride roller coasters, go to horror movies, do rock climbing. That's all fine. But if I confront a phobia in the playroom to get a big scare, I'm the weird one. But it's the same adrenaline. So I was just explaining to people who weren't kinky, we're all just a bag of chemicals in skin, and we have the same chemicals as you. We're just a bit more honest about the sexual benefit we get from those chemicals.
Wow. Never heard explained that way. That's clear to me.
Well, that's how I instinctively saw BDSM when I walked into playrooms during my year as IML. That's how I would see it. I realize now that's how an autistic person sees the world. We are looking through a window at humans on the other side, almost like we're anthropologists trying to come up with rules to explain the play of other people because we don't naturally get it. So all these times when I'd walk into a dungeon and my head would analyze and come up with a model and some rules and go, this is what's happening, made me a very good presenter. But now I realize that's how an autistic person sees the world, because we need rules to explain it.
Where are you now? Sexually, kink-wise, where are you? If there was no pandemic and that were taken out of the equation, what would be your interest today? Has it changed since 20 or 30 years ago? What's John into right now? That's a simple way of asking. What are you into?
I still love cutting. I still love needles. I still love being trampled. I still love beating and being beaten. I love any kind of thuddy impact play. I'm not a fan of Sting, but with my sir in Michigan, I will do Sting as an act of submission. So if he has a fiber rod, I'll hold out an arm and let him strike it. And I wouldn't do that for anyone else because I don't enjoy it. But for him, it's almost like a mark of respect. But I would do it. I love anything with the human body, skin on skin, because I find I can excuse If you're using a toy on me, I can excuse it that it's not you doing this, it's the toy. But as soon as somebody removes the gloves and they're using their hands to hurt me, I have no explanation for that in my head, and I really feel it. I feel it on quite a primal level. If there's wrestling holds and lock joints, anything, I think my passion probably is stuff with the human body. Plus, it means I can travel internationally and I never worry about the cases being delayed or what can or can't go in the luggage. Mm-hmm. So I teach a workshop on, I call it Unarmed BDSM, 90 things you can do with the human body in 90 minutes. It's just BDSM tapas, a minute on each, from water sports, face slapping, wrestling holds, trampling, chest punching. We cover everything just really lightly for 90 minutes just to see the light bulbs go up in people's head that I don't need to have money to do this. I don't need to have, my own lathe in the garage to make my toys. This is accessible to people regardless of wealth or skill base or class structure. It's just me and you behind the Coke machine, and I can still find a way to make you go, ow.
I want to take that class. You're a player.
Thank you. I know I shouldn't see, I spent my year telling people that there's no hierarchy between the SM guys and the people who wear leather as a fetish guys and the people who are bikers and the people who smoke cigars. We might all be different groups, but one is not better than the other. Just find your group of people. I spent all the time saying that, but whenever anyone comes up and goes, "You're a player," I just say, "Thank you." I turn into that little 4-year-old at school playing with the dolls. Going, "Thank you."
Well, I mean, the reality is, if you go to a leather event or you go to a leather contest, it's an overlap of two cultures. You've got the guys who are into BDSM and who wear leather, if not when they normally play, they do to attend an event. And then you've got guys who are into leather, and that's a turn on. That's okay too, but they're two totally different people coming together.
I have a theory that more people are into kink than they realize. The difference is that they don't use the vocabulary and they find the vocabulary off-putting. So, for instance, most people under questioning would answer that they change their breathing before orgasm. Either they hold their breath or they hyperventilate. That's breath control. That's playing with the oxygen content of their brain. But if you said to them, what you're doing is breath control, they would react very, I have played with somebody who insisted they weren't into BDSM. They were only into boots, and it wasn't anything kinky. They just liked boots. And we would sit having breakfast and their body would be covered in my boot prints. And I'd just be laughing, thinking a normal, vanilla person wouldn't have that many marks on their body, but they would insist this isn't kinky, this is boots. So it's however you need to process it. But there are definitely people put off by the language. And I think that's what separates us, is kinky people have a language for it. But most people I've played with, especially the vanilla ones, if I put their hands to the headboard and just made them hold onto the headboard, would voluntarily keep holding the headboard. That's bondage without restraints. That's mental bondage. But if I said that, they would get freaked. So I don't say it. I don't use the language. But in my head, a lot more people are kinky than would be happy using that term. Or maybe I just make them kinky. I've never met a vanilla person that I couldn't kinkify somehow, even if I was just running it in my head as like a movie screen while we were doing what we were doing. It's always got to be kinky for me. So I'm always adding that in.
There are people who go to a leather event that are not into power exchange at all.
Yes. And I remember one night at the Hoist, it very much seemed to be that way. There was a lot of kind of bodybuilders in harnesses who were under spotlights. And I was with another guy who, it wasn't that we needed a DS environment, but we were missing the fact there was nobody there supplying that. So we said, why don't we just do something between the two of us? So we went to a wall, and they had a little rail that was like a bit of plank nailed to the brick that wasn't enough to sit on, but you could kind of perch on it. And we agreed I would put my bottom on this rail and I'd put my hands behind my back and I'd bow my head, and the other guy would stand in front of me drinking. And he was free to drink and interact with other people, but he wouldn't move from where he was standing. Whereas I had to sit on the rail and I had to stare at his lower back and channel all of my energy into his lower back. And for the next, I don't know how long, to me it felt 20 minutes, it might have been 5. But for the next period of time, his chest was puffing up and he was getting more and more confident because he knew I was channeling this energy into his back. And we drew a huge crowd of people trying to work out what was happening. They knew something was happening, but they didn't have the vocabulary for it. And after a period of time, we just broke and we looked at each other and agreed we couldn't top that. We weren't going to have sex or play anymore because that was the scene that night. But it really intrigued a whole load of guys. But we just wanted to interject that it's not that we were better than anybody else, but it's great if a leather bar has that in the mix.
That power exchange energy. I didn't expect to be talking so much about kink today, John. I don't know why, but I'm glad we did.
And you got to be careful. If you pull a string on my back and we get onto a topic I like, I will keep going.
Well, this worked out perfectly then. Yeah. Gay conversion therapy, IML winner, comedian, life coach, and you have written about being an outsider. On the topic of outsiders, you wrote on your website, I want to help other people, especially those who feel like an outsider. You may feel that way because of your gender or sexuality, neurodiversity, health diagnosis, or just a feeling of not fitting in. Do you still feel like an outsider? Or do you think that's behind you?
I know I'm an outsider, and it depends on the room that I'm in. If I'm in a particularly heterosexual environment, I'm an outsider because I'm a gay man. If I'm in a neurotypical environment, I'm an outsider because I'm autistic. I often have that feeling of being an outsider, and I'm aware it comes with particular difficulties for us. And it could be anybody. It could be because your skin isn't white and everybody else's skin is in a room. But it can leave you with shame, not just through gay conversion therapy, but by not seeing yourself represented in any kind of media. You can grow up with that internalized shame. It can also leave you with a trait of people pleasing, in that you feel like you're masking all the time to be acceptable to other people. And so you're always validating other people's perception of you above and over your own perception of yourself. And yourself gets invalidated every time you mask. So there were some stand-up comedy gigs I did where I was worried about coming out as gay, and I would change the pronouns in the jokes to pass as straight because I didn't want to get beaten up to the car afterwards. Mm-hmm. That was me retreating to a place of safety, but it also meant every word that came out of my mouth on stage was invalidating myself. And this can have consequences. I'm not saying that anybody should stop masking to fit in because it's retreating to a place of safety. There can be a really good reason why you do it, but we need to be aware of the cost to ourselves and our lives. And it's really good to talk to somebody in a space where that person gets you and you can lower your mask over time and you can talk about the shame that you feel or the people pleasing that you do and get a bit more control back over your own life.
What I'm hearing is being an outsider is something you may always be, and in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's how you own it.
I think there's nothing wrong in being an outsider, but I think there is huge value in finding your people so that there are places during a week when I could be with other autistic people and feel normal. That's how everybody else feels the whole time, but I only get it if I'm in a space with other autistic people. So I think it's a great idea to find your group of people who you can be with. And if there's nobody in your life where you feel you can drop your guard, I'm willing to be that person and I'll volunteer to be that person. So it's psychologically quite important that there should be moments where you can remember who you are. Because I remember when I came out as autistic and somebody said, oh, you can stop masking now. And I had no idea where masking ended and I began, because I'd had 45 years of trying to copy other people, copy eye contact, copy sentence length, not dominating a conversation too much, trying to do small talk. I would come up with scripts. If we were at an elevator and we'd press the button and a stranger joined us, I had a flow chart for how to get through the next 3 minutes. And it was exhausting. I used to tell people my flowchart and they would get exhausted just hearing it, that I would have to know if there had been a big sports game recently or there was one coming up. I'd have to know what the weather was. I'd have to make sure I said things that weren't personal, just to time it for the lift going down, that I could fill the space with a conversation that somehow I passed as normal. And yet even putting in all that work, I'm sure they would get out the lift and still think, there's something not quite right about that person. Whereas now I actually feel much more confident just getting in the lift and keeping quiet.
We need to live and be who we are. We need to be able to feel comfortable in our own skin.
As long as we bring safeguarding into that, because for some people in the world, it is not safe for them to go out of their front door and be gay or go out of their door and be black. So we need to acknowledge safeguarding, and masking is there for a reason. It gets you to a place of safety. But at the same time, there's a cost. So all that I do in my coaching is acknowledge the cost and then help people make choices that are right for them.
Life's not easy, is it? Is there anything specific you wanted to share today?
I just turned 50 and I'm absolutely terrified of what the next decade will bring, because the first 20 years of my life, I was convinced I was heterosexual. And then in my 20s, I discovered I was gay, but I was really terrible at it. I didn't enjoy any gay venue that I went to. And then in my 30s, I discovered I was kinky, and I did that like full. I went into that to be professional kink educator and kinky stand-up comedian so I could be booked and it would be my profession, traveling the world full time. And I loved it. And then in my 40s, I discovered I was autistic. And that maybe put a question mark on why I loved kink so much. And now I'm about to get into my 50s and I'm thinking, what's going to happen next when I turn the page? What's the next big discovery?
What do you want to happen next?
Nothing. Could we just have a break of discovery? It would be lovely if I could just go for a meal and relax and not worry that I was about to have some big epiphany. But I've had a few. One
thing I didn't expect to see on your website for sure, spoiler alert here, guys, you're the first person to be killed after the opening credits in No Time to Die.
Yes. So this isn't giving away the plot of the movie, but there's half an hour of preamble, and then there's the opening credits, and then some bad guys are doing a heist, and they come down the outside of a building on rope, and they blow out a window, and they go down a corridor, and then we cut to some scientists chatting, where that's the thing that's going to be stolen, and then they cut back to the night watchman, who has a blonde beard and is reading a self-help book, and he gets shot. And that's me. And it was my self-help book that I took on set to read while they were setting up between takes. And the director thought it was funny that I would get killed reading a self-help book.
Oh my God, I can't wait to see it and see that.
And the reason I got that part is because I tied up Michael Fassbender in Assassin's Creed so that he could be put to death. And the same crew were working on No Time to Die. And they remembered that I'd done a good job tying up Michael Fassbender.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And that was several things. I put him in manacles to walk him down a corridor, and I had leather straps to get him onto a table. And they do this from several camera angles and several takes over. So each time you have to undo everything and give it back to the props master between each take. And at one time I was taking the manacles off Michael Fassbender, and the props master looked at me and said, "You've done this before, haven't you?" And I said, "Yes, every weekend." And he looked at me and went, "You film a movie every weekend."
Wow. John, thank you very much for being on Sexual Heroes today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I've loved every minute. Thank you.
For information with links about a guest on Sexual Heroes, visit the show notes. And please be sure to follow me on Twitter @RobertBlackXXX. Thanks for listening.